More than 3 million salmon returned to the Columbia River Basin in 2001, more than any time since official counts began in 1938. Salmon were so plentiful that people could buy them from fishermen along the river for less than $2 a pound. They were so plentiful that thousands of pounds of fresh-caught salmon were given to Northwest food banks. They were so plentiful that the National Marine Fisheries Service authorized sport fishing on protected runs in both Oregon and Washington. Fishermen in Idaho enjoyed their best Chinook fishing in decades. But aren't Northwest salmon an endangered species protected under the Endangered Species Act? And why are Northwest salmon the only species listed under the Endangered Species Act that you can buy in a can in your neighborhood grocery? Just a few years ago, we were told that Northwest salmon were going extinct. The National Marine Fisheries Service listed 22 runs of salmon and steelhead as threatened or endangered. And environmental groups even wanted to tear down huge hydroelectric dams on the Snake River for the sake of the salmon. Now we have record salmon runs throughout the Northwest. So how can this be explained? There's no doubt that wild salmon runs have been declining for many years. Many environmentalists blamed the 4 Snake River dams, which were completed in the mid-1970s, while others blamed overfishing, urban growth that industrialized many of our rivers and streams, logging, and, yes, agriculture. But many scientists now point to ocean conditions, which began to turn unfavorable for Northwest salmon about 20 years ago, as the single most significant cause of declining salmon runs. And they point to improving ocean conditions as the single biggest reason for the record runs.
Biggest factor, though, is clearly the ocean.
So it's really been the ocean conditions which have been the bottleneck, the limiting factor in salmon abundance and survival. It's been grossly misunderstood, and perhaps purposely so by some of the agencies who have just chosen to ignore the data.
Still, many people continue to believe that Northwest salmon are in danger of going extinct. And despite the record runs, Northwest salmon remain on the endangered species list. At this point, the issue revolves around the role of hatcheries and what many people believe is a misuse of the Endangered Species Act.
There aren't very many instances, as I said yet, where we can show that hatcheries have actually produced fish that successfully perpetuate subsequent generations. What we're trying to find out is how do we manage them better to accomplish our objectives, either return fish to catch without impacting protected fish, or using hatcheries to actually help restore protected fish.
There have been salmon hatcheries in the Northwest since the 1880s. When the Snake River dams were built almost a century later, more hatcheries were built to supplement wild runs. There are now over 150 salmon hatcheries throughout the Northwest, operated by state, federal, private, and tribal agencies. But the National Marine Fisheries doesn't count hatchery fish when it assesses the strength of salmon runs. And for the most part, only so-called wild fish are protected under the Endangered Species Act.
Salmon recovery with respect to hatcheries is not about numbers, it's about quality. Hatcheries have been producing lots of fish for a long time. Hatchery fish have been spawning in the wild for 100 years. And what we've learned from that is that those techniques won't work. What we really need to do is create a type of fish, a quality of fish that can survive in the wild.
Proponents of this wild fish policy contend that salmon spawned and raised in a hatchery are somehow genetically different than salmon that spawn in a river or stream.
Something about the way the hatcheries operate, the selection of parents, the rearing of these fish in raceways or various places has changed the fish to where they are not as adapted to the stream as fish that have grown up in the stream.
Others in the scientific community dispute this. Dr. Jim Lannon, Professor Emeritus from Oregon State University Fisheries Sciences, states,
"There's no genetic difference. They are the same animal. There are some behavioral differences that can be identified. At the present time, there's no evidence that these differences have a genetic basis. And in fact, I don't think that it will ever be shown that they have a genetic basis.
Also in dispute is whether hatchery fish are somehow inferior or less able to survive than so-called wild salmon. Dr. Don Amond, fisheries biologist for over 35 years, explains these behavioral differences.
Those differences that are perceived or you can demonstrate in a hatchery are transient, and they're not long lasting, and the fish come back in very good numbers. In fact, the survival rates are very high. How can you explain that 80% or more of the fish returning from the ocean are hatchery fish if they're somehow inferior? If they were that inferior and genetically inferior, we wouldn't have any salmon. I mean, they would have disappeared a long time ago. And the fact that they must go to the ocean, compete and survive, and spend most of, if they couldn't survive and compete in the ocean, they just wouldn't come back. And there's really no genetic difference between the hatchery fish and a fish that is naturally spawned in an adjacent stream.
Ironically, even the National Marine Fisheries Service considers the offspring of hatchery salmon that wander off course and spawn naturally instead of returning to the hatchery to be wild fish and deserving of protection under the Endangered Species Act. Critics of this wild fish policy argued that the only way the government can justify listing Northwest salmon under the Endangered Species Act is if you don't count most of the fish, which is exactly what the National Marine Fisheries Service has done.
When the Endangered Species Act came along, it was clear that what we're trying to protect under the Endangered Species Act is naturally self-sustaining populations, and that hatchery populations don't count in that.
In order to list Northwest salmon as threatened or endangered, the Fisheries Service divided the 6 true species of Northwest salmonids into dozens of smaller groups it called evolutionary significant units. Then it counted only the naturally spawning fish in each ESU to determine the strength of the run.
What an ESU is, ESU stands for evolutionarily significant unit. And what that means is that's the terminology we use to describe a distinct group of fish. A group of fish that is distinctive from all other fish and is not interchangeable.
By focusing on these ESUs and not counting hatchery fish, state and local governments are exerting control over millions of acres of land and thousands of miles of rivers and streams. Farmers and ranchers are being told they have to give up land and water, which many people believe was the real goal all along.
This has nothing to do with salmon. It has to do with getting control of our water, taking control of our lives, taking control of your property. I mean, you control the water, you control everything.
Science is being used as a shill. It's a decoy to cover up the fact that this is actually a political agenda.
In the spring of 2001, federal agencies shut off water for irrigation to thousands of acres in the Klamath Basin, an area of southern Oregon and northern California that was homesteaded by farmers and ranchers who were promised water by the U.S. government after World War I.
For the first time in history, we've decided we're not going to give it to the farmers. We're going to give it to the coho, to the river, and to the lake, and to the suckers.
These federal agencies argued the water was needed for sucker fish that lived in Upper Klamath Lake and for coho salmon that used the downstream river. But sucker fish are plentiful and feed on the bottom of the lake, so many biologists believe deeper water doesn't do them any good. And releasing water downriver when farmers need it most doesn't help the coho. There is also a growing number of fisheries biologists in the scientific community that say our salmon in many of our streams are recovering.
Now finally we're starting to get recovery. You see recovery in your southern Chinook stocks, everything from the Rogue River south. These fish have basically recovered. You're seeing nice recovery in your Columbia River Chinook stocks. We've had phenomenal runs starting last fall and improving this spring. And these are good runs that are starting to come back.
Thousands of people gathered in Klamath Falls that summer to protest the denial of water for thousands of farm families and helped focus the attention on the use or abuse of the Endangered Species Act.
But Klamath Falls is a microcosm of what's going to happen on the Columbia River over a greater geographical area involving many more people, many more industries, many more entitlements in states. So we're right on the cusp.
Many people fear that what has happened to farmers and ranchers in the Klamath Basin could be repeated throughout the Columbia Basin. Another area of the Northwest where farmers have suffered because of the listing of salmon and denial of water for irrigation is the Methow Valley in north central Washington. For 3 years in a row, valley residents were denied water to irrigate their crops by federal officials who said the water was needed instead to protect salmon. Ironically, in this case, the salmon they were protecting were hatchery fish.
The Chinook salmon mostly are hatchery fish. We have a determination that there's probably about 2% of the run is natural. Same is true for summer Chinook or fall Chinook. Most of the steelhead are all hatchery fish.
They're trying to limit our water use or take our water use away from us. That's obvious. And this is what's really crazy is that these fish aren't even native fish. They're fish that were brought in from Carson Hatchery. And that's where our Chinook came from. And our steelhead aren't endangered either.
After a federal judge ruled in the summer of 2001 that the National Marine Fisheries Service could not list wild coastal coho for protection under the Endangered Species Act without including genetically identical hatchery salmon, the agency agreed to reconsider its wild fish policy. Many groups, including the Washington Farm Bureau, have also petitioned for delisting of most Northwest salmon, arguing that if hatchery fish are counted, there is no justification for revoking the Endangered Species Act and all the water and land use regulations that come with it, especially in light of record runs in 2001 and the equally strong runs forecast for 2002. But it could take months or even years before questions about the validity of the listing are resolved. And those who believe the real goal of the Endangered Species Act is to gain control of the water and land aren't hopeful.
I think myself that they're trying to get us all out of here. And the way they're going to do that is they're going to destroy the economy of the area, which they've already pretty much done. And people will leave, and that's what they want.
They have lost money because of the water. That's not, we need our water. You can't just take it from us. We feed you, we give you food, we give America food. You can't take our water from the farmers or the ranchers.